Does the Aimpoint Comp M5 deserve a chance at redemption after we unceremoniously murdered our previous one by dropping it on a rock? I mean, you clicked on the video and you're already here, so yeah, probably. What is up, guys? My name is John with PewPewTactical.com, your definitive source for gun reviews, gear guides, and all things that go bang. Earlier this year, we rounded up a bunch of expensive optics and proceeded to run them through a series of stress tests in an attempt to ascertain which high-end names would stand up to increasingly absurd levels of abuse and still function, ultimately ending in a 22LR Magnum execution shot. You know, for science. Perhaps one of the most surprising results of that test was the Aimpoint Comp M5's failure during one of the early trials that all other optics survived. An impact test from about 4 feet up directly onto a large rock. While nothing appeared super broken upon inspection of that previous optic, the wiring harness that sits inside the battery compartment was flung outside of the optic itself, rendering it unusable in the field without tools. So full disclosure, the optic that we're reviewing is actually a second Comp M5 that Aimpoint sent us as a replacement, assuring us that the previous one's battery compartment exploding is just a freak accident that can happen if it takes a nasty spill directly onto a hard surface at just the right angle. Like we've said before, none of this testing is incredibly scientific in nature, and since there's no way to ensure that each optic we dropped was hitting the same place at the same angle on the same spot on the rock, we didn't see a reason not to take our second Comp M5 out for a spin and evaluate it on the normal things that you talk about when you play with optics instead of trying to destroy them. The Comp M5 is sort of a mid-sized red dot profile-wise. If you're familiar, it's not as beefy as Aimpoint's patrol rifle optic or the older Comp M4s, but it's also not quite as tiny as the Aimpoint Micro T1. The idea here is that you've got something much lighter compared to a lot of older, heavier models out there, but it's still large enough to pair nicely with Aimpoint's own 3 or 6x magnifiers. It's also strictly a 2 MOA dot optic, compared to the Micro T1s that can be had in either 2 or 4 MOA, emphasizing that the Comp M5 is intended for both short and medium range shooting, rather than strictly close-up shots. The Comp M5 we received had these kind of cool, flip-down plastic lens covers, reminiscent of the built-in polymer caps on older models, and I kind of like them a bit more than the rubber bikini-style covers that typically come with smaller red dot optics. These things are expensive, and considering the fact that I lose shit constantly, be it rubber bikini scope covers or my car keys, I appreciate the fact that having them integrated into the optic itself means that my dumbass doesn't have the opportunity to do that. The rear flip-down lens is also clear, while the front cap is your standard black polymer. The idea here being that if you're aiming with both eyes open like you should be with a red dot sight, your brain is naturally going to combine the images from your right and left eyes into one, meaning that you'll still be able to see the dot projected onto your target despite the fact that the front lens cover is closed. Although I'm not a huge fan of shooting with them flipped down because it does feel like it narrows your POV through the optic a tiny bit, the ability to pick up the gun and go without fiddling with lens caps means you've got one less thing to worry about in an emergency use case scenario. And if that's something that you're concerned about when you're shopping for a red dot sight, I would hazard a guess that you might be the type that leaves the optic on when the gun is in storage. And if that's the case, you can take refuge in the fact that this thing can run on position 7, one down from the top setting of brightness for close to 5 years, maxed out brightness can run for 1 year continuously, and the lower settings that are all night vision compatible can run for up to 10 years. Build-wise, the Comp M5 feels solid but not too hefty, weighing in at about 8.5 ounces in its standard configuration with a mount. We've got this throw lever mount here that works pretty well once you've got it clamped down on your optics rail, and the throw lever locks in place securely via a small metal lug that slips down into a portion of the mount that hugs the rail. To remove the optic, simply lift up and move the lever towards the barrel, and the mount will pop right back off. The system's a lot less frustrating than some of the other throw lever locking systems for optics we've played with in the past, and you thankfully won't be destroying your fingers trying to get the thing off if you need to. Your windage and elevation knobs are pretty low profile and hug the frame of the optic itself, with a little bit of a raised surface around the outside that serve as impact protection rather than leaving the turrets exposed to the threat of physics. One thing I will say though is that I'm not a huge fan of the turret adjustments needing to be done with the reverse side of the plastic caps that cover them. The caps have these two little nubs that correspond to dimples on the face of your windage and elevation adjustment turrets, and while I definitely like the concept of keeping the tool you need to play with your Zero attached to the optic itself, see previous car keys comment, I personally find that the caps themselves are a tiny bit small to get a really good purchase on. It's not really a huge deal at all, and it's fine once you get the hang of it, but if you've got larger hands, or it's cold out, or you're wearing gloves, or any other scenario that's going to impact your finger dexterity, it can be a little bit annoying. But again, it's really not going to come into play unless you're taking it off and throwing it on different uppers and needing to re-zero constantly. I've actually had the Comp M5 kicking around for the past few months, and have had the opportunity to throw it on a few different rifles, and once it's zeroed and ready to go, it's a pretty cool little mid-sized optic that I've had a lot of fun with. As for the view through the optic itself, it's nice. The glass is clear and relatively free from the sort of dim bluish hue occasionally found on other red dots. Although I will say that your field of view through the Comp M5 starts feeling a little bit cramped with that rear lens cover on if you're, say, trying to co-witness the dot with normal iron sights, as seen here on this Daniel Defense AR setup. Brightness-wise, as mentioned, you've got a total of 8 settings to flip through, with the brightest options being plenty for even super bright California summertime sunlight, and the lowest 4 settings being compatible with night vision for passive aiming if you've got a setup that allows for aiming an optic through helmet-mounted nods. While the M5 is going to work just fine on most AR-15 builds, if given the choice, I would probably relegate it to something like a smaller PCC or AR pistol build, where you're really going to get the most mileage out of this really slim mid-size profile. And to that extent, if you already own a gun sort of in that category, something like a small 9mm truck gun, something of that nature, and you are looking for a red dot sight that sits between small micro red dots and larger bulkier stuff, I'd imagine you're probably going to have a lot of fun with this setup. And now for the not so sweet part. With an MSRP of around $800 or so without the mount, to say that the Comp M5 might be cost prohibitive for some is maybe a bit of an understatement. But for those looking specifically for a red dot sight that walks that thin line between too much and not enough, who might also need the ability to occasionally punch up your effective range through the addition of a perfectly paired Aimpoint branded magnifier, the Comp M5 might just be for you. Just try to avoid dropping it directly on a rock if you can. Alright guys, that's gonna do it for us today. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, as we've got lots more on the way. Once again, my name is John with Pew Pew Tactical, and we will see you next time.